Okay, I think we've got pretty close to a quorum, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully taking a little bit of a lunch break, depending on the time zone you're in. We really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today. So just as a housekeeping item, I'll be sort of emceeing, and we'll do introductions in just a few minutes here. But recognizing also that we've got folks that are coming from different parts of organizations here and from health plans. So ranging from people who really drive and administer member communications up to folks who are leading and driving engagement strategies, gaps in care closures. So we want to be sure that we're incorporating everyone into the conversation as you hear us talk through these things. Just know that that's the audience we've got here, and that's how we want to make sure this messaging lands. And we are here today to talk about Medicare STAR ratings. I'm sure many of you your heads are so in the throes of open enrollment around this coming year. And so a lot of this is park it in your brain as we come up for air in January and start really trying to think about engagement strategies. How can we put this hat back on and think about STAR ratings and accelerating member engagement and the value that we can create there? So a lot of detail we're really excited to jump into. And just very quickly from an agenda standpoint, we'll do a couple introductions here in a minute for folks that are meeting our esteemed guest speakers or some of the Clarity folks that you might not have had a chance to meet. We're going to talk about 2022 STAR ratings in context. So certainly not a 101, but what's the latest and what are we really responding to as health plans in the coming year? And then get into what are some of the fundamentals and best practices when we talk about engaging that population. And that's really the part of this conversation we're thrilled to bring you with expertise from some of our partners who you'll hear from in just a moment. But I think the key to engaging this population is understanding them. And as easy as that can be to say, it's actually quite challenging to do. So we've got good insight for you there. We'll talk about integrating behavioral science into everything that we do and hopefully encouraging you to incorporate behavioral science into everything you're doing with your member communications as well. And finally, we want the takeaway from this to feel like you're empowered to take action. And so we're going to talk about the ways that we can really translate from theory into practical application and actually moving the needle on STAR's non-member engagement over the course of next year. So with that, I'll quickly give an introduction. I'm Drew Corbett. I've met many of you who I know have joined here today. I'm a Vice President of Product Innovation with Clarity, really coming to Clarity from a background of member, consumer, and patient engagement. And so have spent the bulk of the last 10 years of my career both directly in the member engagement space, was involved with a platform called WellTalk and Cafe Well, which had a pretty sizable footprint in the member engagement space, and also have a background in provider and payer strategy. So that's the hat that I'm wearing, and that's how I'll be speaking to these things today. Scott, can I give you an opportunity just to really give a view from the top on what we're doing here and why you feel it's a valuable conversation also?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to, Drew. Appreciate it. So as Drew mentioned, my name is Scott Roderman. I am a board member of Clarity and Chief Strategy Officer. I've been in healthcare IT for the last just under 30 years. And as you look at member engagement, founded a company that Drew mentioned, WellTalk Cafe Well, about 13 years ago, and specifically focused on driving member engagement. So as Drew mentioned, today's discussion around Medicare, what we've done here at Clarity, and really what we've done really for the last decade plus, is really look at different opportunities to drive engagement. When you see certain opportunities, right, you really got to look at every single touch point for the member, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an email, whether it's an ID card, whether it's an EOB. There's all sorts of touch points that can impact that member journey and make that member journey that much more productive and that much more engaging for all the different assets and solutions that you bring to bear. So the discussion today, specific emphasis on Medicare, yeah, this time of year is crazy, right? Nobody's thinking about how we can implement this in the next week, 2 weeks. But as we do round the corner into early 22, you really should start to think about some of the things that we're going to share today with Drew and Adrienne Tenney, who I'm going to introduce next and have her introduce herself. But I think there's some valuable pieces of information on how to really capture that additional value and additional engagement techniques to get people to, follow through with that in-home assessment, that annual wellness visit, start to close gaps, start to impact stars. There's little things that you can do and little engagement techniques that we're going to share today, which we look forward to doing. So Adrienne, if you don't mind, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Drew. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Again, my name is Adrienne Tenney. I'm a senior manager with Engageus. I've spent the last 20 years working in healthcare, starting out in the provider space, and more recently focused on roles in consumer engagement, which brought me to Engageus in 2018. And for those of you that are not familiar with us, we are a consulting and research firm, laser focused on healthcare consumer engagement, and we support projects across people, process, and technology. So super excited to partner with Drew and Scott today to share some of our insights and best practices with you. Our hope is that these small shifts in your member communications can help drive positive change for your members and your star ratings. So I'll get us started, share some thoughts about this year's star ratings, and highlight a few Engageus best practices before I hand it off to Drew to take us a little further down the path to see what these tactics can do to drive engagement. So Drew, if you want to go to the first slide. Thank you.
And Adrienne, I'll just comment also that, for clarity, having partnered with Engageus on some of the depth of understanding, some of the depth of research around the behavioral principles associated with member engagement, and in particular in the healthcare field, thinking about Medicare plans, that's really been a valuable partnership. So know that Engageus is a group that we've been working with for, I think, the better part of a year, and ongoing, and had an impact with many of you already. So just by way of that introduction, also been a great partnership with Clarity.
Thanks. So we're going to start here. Let's just unpack the STARS ratings for 2022 a bit. I'm sure most of you are familiar with STARS. I just want to do a quick level set in case there are folks that aren't living and breathing Medicare STARS in their day-to-day. So each year CMS gathers data across 5 categories. They focus on things like access to preventive services, chronic condition management, member experience, member complaints, and customer service. And they use the data to assign an overall performance rating of 1 to 5 stars. And getting to that 4-star or higher threshold unlocks financial and other benefits. So it's a really big motivator. The other thing I want to point out here is that in those categories, you heard a lot of the word member, and each one has the member at the center of it. That's important to keep in mind as we go forward. So I think most folks who are interested in star ratings have had a chance to see where they landed. And what does that tell us? What should we consider? What kinds of challenges and opportunities can we expect? And if you're scanning the headlines here, one of the obvious takeaways is more stars for more plans than ever before. So on the surface, points to competition, but it's certainly not that simple. We know the pandemic impacted access to care and operations immensely. And as a result, accommodations were put in place to help fill the data gaps for star ratings. So if you're thinking maybe these ratings are a little inflated, or there could be some whiplash in the next year or two as more accurate data comes in, you're probably not wrong. Another consideration, even though these ratings are high, we hear time and time again from seniors that the Medicare STAR ratings aren't a big influencer in how they choose their plans. They're more focused on convenience. If their provider is covered in that plan, they're more likely to stay. It's just easier for them. And it's why we see beneficiaries maintain their original coverage at an average of 85% year over year. So something to pay attention to. Another thing to consider from the member perspective is that during the pandemic, members and plans were uniquely aligned for maybe the first time ever. We all cared about the same things, so the messages that came through about COVID-19 felt relevant and timely and highly personal with very little effort. The ability to maintain that rapport and that relationship as things shift to a new normal will be incredibly challenging, especially if you're not doing some very basic things. And don't forget that next year, the patient experience measures and star ratings will be worth 4 times what they are now. So that becomes over 50% of a plan's overall star rating that's focused purely on member experience, which is concerning. So let's talk a little bit about why that's concerning. Next slide, Drew. So we know that health plans and healthcare in general have not been as successful at improving customer experience as other industries. And at the heart of that is member communications. Research has repeatedly shown this to be the case, and I'm highlighting some recent examples here that reiterates it yet again. So to just pull out a couple of points here, there's a lot of interesting insights on the slide, but the 2 positive ones I want to showcase are clear, helpful, proactive communications are a key driver for member satisfaction. And in addition to that, feeling appreciated, respected, and valued really drives retention. So what's at the heart of getting this right? It's personalization. And my next few slides will help outline an approach to help you get there. So Drew, if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, and can I actually just make a comment on this one,
Sure.
Adrian, that I think it's easy to get into a STARS discussion, and we're actually going to look at some of the CMS data on it. And it's easy to make it a macro, empirical, actuarial type of an exercise. And to some ends of the health plan, that may be true, but I think the point that you emphasized at the tail end there, so that top bullet point in the middle, ultimately, this is about, do members feel appreciated and are they satisfied? And so as many downstream economic implications as there are, and as big as our staffs may be looking at the numbers and how the dollars shake out, I do think that's an important place to emphasize that ultimately it's about, have you made a connection with a person, and does that person ultimately reflect that when a HOS question or a CAP survey is placed in front of them? That's really where we're spending our time focusing, because we know that the downstream yield is where the dollars flow. But to start with that member-centric, I think is a good point that you made.
Agreed. So let's stay on this slide for a minute. Before I jump into my next set of slides, we have a quick poll that we'd like your input on, and April's going to help us with that. So she'll put that question up for you all. Don't worry about getting the answer right. Just go with your gut. I'm going to give you the right answer on the next slide anyway. And as you all are responding and thinking about that for a minute, I just want to highlight that the next few slides are going to take you through what we think of almost as a funnel. So follow along as I go through the next slides and think of them as sort of sequential steps to get you down to a specific communication. And I have a specific example at the end of these slides that I'll really dig into for you all, so that you have that specific example to see just how much opportunity there can be in just one piece. All right. So we've got kind of a split
kind of a
here.
curve. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you are thinking it's somewhere 25 to 75%, which is great. And I'll tell you why. So the answer is 91% of seniors are using a cell phone and 61% are using a smartphone. And the point here is know your audience. So the senior population is diverse and complex. And if you don't understand your audience, you're going to miss those opportunities. So for folks who are surprised by that statistic, seniors are using digital channels, and that train has left the station. So if you're not incorporating them into your Medicare communications, get on board. It's a great addition. And for those of you who are aware of this digital adoption in the population, that's fantastic, but there's even more that you can do. So often we do focus groups with seniors at Engage Us, and it helps us gain insights that we wouldn't otherwise get. For instance, seniors actually welcome communications from their health plan, and that's not the case for every population. So if that's news to you, it might help you rethink your strategy a bit. And in cases where you may be struggling to get to know your audience and to get to those insights, we've seen seniors complete surveys at a rate of nearly 2 times what folks under 40 will do. So if you have some burning questions, find a way to ask. If you can unlock those insights and you can understand your audience behavior a bit more, it can really help to inform your segmentation strategy. So Drew, I know this is one of your favorite slides too. Is there anything else that you want to call out here?
Well, I guess one thing, there are a couple things. So one is you're mentioning the survey, and if I'm again mapping back to what the member engagement, member satisfaction mechanism of measurement is within STARS, it is going to come back to surveying in many instances. So the opportunity is ripe for those things to align. And I think the other points that are brought out here, so whether we're looking at gender or other demographic or geolocation, I think my main takeaway is that this is not a monolithic population. This is not a singular point of view. So learning more of what works with whom, I think if that's not central to what's going on from an engagement perspective or how we're using tone or voice with that population, then almost invariably we're leaving something on the table, because the areas where they have an affinity or have an aversion are pretty pronounced. And if we gloss right over that, it's a population that's going to notice.
Agreed. Great. Next slide. So the example we're looking at here for segmentation is addressing colonoscopy. The point here is that it's not enough to simply pull a list of members that need a colonoscopy and send them the same communication. If you do that, you're missing an opportunity. If you look just a little bit deeper at data that you already have, it will tell you who's missing a primary care physician or who hasn't had a well visit in the last 12 months. And these are likely barriers to getting the colonoscopy. So we know that members who have a PCP and are seen regularly are more likely to complete other health actions such as preventive screenings. So it's really critical to start with behavior, then focus on driving the right action. Relatedly, if you go to the next slide, Drew, unless you have a comment on this one.
No, I don't think so.
Addressing barriers works. We've seen it firsthand with impressive numbers across a variety of campaigns, and I'm highlighting some of those here, but I don't want to mislead you either. I think it's important to highlight that these results are possible, but you should know that small, steady incremental gains are just as important. What we saw in 2021 STAR ratings was that over 65% of plans missed hitting the 4-star threshold in CAPS, HOS, and HEDIS measures by just 1 to 2%. So next time you're considering if it's worth the effort or investment, take a closer look and be ready with the right tactics, because addressing those barriers can really help move the needle. So what kind of tactics can we use to drive engagement? How do we get folks to take action and push through those barriers? Covering that in the next slide.
Yep. Adrian, can I actually put you on the spot just for a second when we have
Sure.
the barriers conversation? I think it's easy for us to get a short list of what the barriers are in mind and have those be, oftentimes we're thinking about maybe internet access or we're thinking about physical proximity to a provider. But could you just open up a little bit more on those barriers, maybe things that we from a health plan perspective don't see, but from that member's perspective, it's pronounced?
I mean, some of the more common barriers that we hear, especially around things like preventive screenings or taking a particular action to close a health gap, are things like I don't have time. I don't have transportation. I didn't know I need it. My doctor hasn't communicated this to me. And so there's that kind of go-to list that we use, and having some snappy responses ready is what helps to get members more comfortable with the idea of actually taking action. They know they have a partner, they know you're there to help. And if you can already address those barriers, it kind of squashes them. And then they can sit back a little bit and go, oh, all right, well, maybe this won't be so difficult. So it depends on what the action is that you're trying to get them to take. But very often it's easy to collect those barriers and understand what they are, and then use that information to come up with some responses, whether it's, agents that are doing outbound calls, or if you're sending out IVR, having that programmed in, or even addressing those barriers in a print communication or an email proactively to make sure that members know there is help if they need it. It's a powerful tool.
I mean, sticking out to me is also the idea that there may be just a healthcare IQ barrier on some of these things. So if we from a health plan are saying there's so much value associated with a colon cancer screening, but where that member is they haven't even signed up for the portal yet, or they might not even have that PCP. So just thinking about in the context of, I'm about to send something to someone, am I meeting them where they are, or am I assuming they're 4 steps ahead of where I'm trying to lead? Yeah.
Exactly. So as this slide says, at Engagis, we believe that behavioral science presents a terrific opportunity. For those that may not be familiar with behavioral science, you may have also heard it referred to as behavioral economics. And it's a field of study that really focuses on human actions. So it spans everything from sociology to psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and even geography and political science. And it's constantly evolving, just like we are. So the application of it in healthcare does require nuance and a fair amount of experience to get it right, but don't let that stop you. In the absence of that experience, a solid test and learn approach can be a really powerful tool to unlock what works and what doesn't. Excuse me. And on this slide, I'm highlighting a few of the principles that we use frequently and the results that we've seen them drive specifically in healthcare communications. But to provide a specific Medicare example, our work has shown that peer pressure tends to be less effective with the senior population, and sometimes it can even create a negative experience. But authority, on the other hand, can be very effective. And authority is the idea that messaging coming from a reputable resource or organization is often more trusted, and seniors welcome that and they respond really well to it. So if you have an opportunity to add a signature from your chief clinical officer or one of your nurse coaches, or guidance from a reputable organization like the American Cancer Society, as an example, take advantage of that and know that these principles can be used in any communication and in any channel. So there's lots of opportunity here. And Drew, I'll pause in case you have any other comments too.
I mean, we're going to get a lot more into this in some of the sections I'm speaking to, but it's an unbelievably potent skill set to start embracing. If we're thinking about the actual ask or the actual information isn't different, the presentation in specific ways is different, and that can drive some of these sort of the percent uptick or not in a population. I think it's got to be a core skill set. So that's my only other comment on it.
Yeah, just real quick, Drew and Adrian. I mean, as you look at this is not net new. If you look at other industries, I mean, they're using this commonplace. You look at health plans and the insurance industry here, we're really lagging behind in terms of how we're driving personalization, how we're leveraging techniques like this. But know that the results are there in spades, right? You look at other industries, they're seeing huge uptick based on leveraging exactly these techniques that you're pointing out right now. And to be honest with you, within this industry, there's a lot of opportunity to really just do slight little tweaks. You don't need to have everything baked. If you don't have, all the data completely organized so we know exactly where every single member is in their journey, Well, we do know some of those data points. So with some of those data points, can we incorporate some of these techniques to get that incremental value and uptick? No question about it.
It's funny, just as a more consumer example, but I remember being on a news website and I refreshed the page and the exact same picture was still the headline picture, but the version of that headline was slightly different. And I sort of had this glimpse into that news organization saying there is value in trying out this way of saying the headline versus that way of saying the headline. Now, granted, that's in the world of you're trying to get clicks on pages to drive ads. It's a totally different business. But the idea of I was sort of part of their corpus of understanding of what is this person more likely to click on? Was it an authoritative headline or was it a FOMO headline, for example? So Scott, to echo your point, I mean, this is everywhere and it's everywhere because it works and it's valuable. We may be more in our infancy as an industry with this, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't really be taking some of the same learnings there.
I agree. And we've definitely seen more and more people adopting this approach and using this as a tactic in their communications. So if you haven't tried it yet, it's a good time to start.
Yeah.
So like I said, with the principles being used broadly, any communication, any channel, it's increasingly important to make sure that your messaging is coordinated across your channel mix, right? You want to maximize that channel mix. You want to get it right. You want to make sure that the messaging across those channels is all synced up. We know digital adoption is increasing in the senior population. So again, if you haven't added that channel to your Medicare communications, you're leaving engagement on the table. Also, we've seen that for every channel you add, you lift engagement. So it's an even more compelling case to consider it. Something else to keep in mind when you're considering your channel mix is that print is a uniquely valuable channel for Medicare. As one of our best practices, we always recommend leading with print for seniors. It's a great way to prepare them for what's coming in those newer digital channels, especially if you're just introducing them for the first time. And it can be used before, during, and after any channel to reinforce messaging because it has the added bonus of familiarity and security. So net is print is a channel that seniors trust. So make sure you don't lose sight of it. And I'm just going to take a minute here and pause because I know I've given you a lot to think about. It's not always easy to shift approach and strategy, but I do want to be sure you leave today with something actionable from me, something you can use tomorrow if you wanted to get a sense of where you stand, where your opportunities are, and what kind of help you may need to capitalize on those opportunities. So this is the next slide here. I want you to think of every sentence as a chance for optimization. The example I have here is a letter. It's where we see a lot of plans struggle. And generally when I'm looking at a letter, I have a specific must-have list. And it is specific to letters, but it does overlap quite a bit with what I'm looking for in most member communications. So if you're not aware of a sort of a must-have list at your organization, take a few notes with what I'm about to say and have your team test it out on a piece or two to see where you land. What does it highlight for you? Are there opportunities available? And if you're looking at this and saying there's a lot going on here, I realize that. But typically when I'm initially looking at a communication, I'm just looking for 5 things. First, does it have a date? Second, does it mention the member's name before a plan or product name? Third, is there a clear and simple call to action, preferably with a value prop added as well? Is there a personal signature? And is there a PS? Now, these all sound very simple, but each one has an impact. And if you use them all together, it can be a big impact. So a date can increase open rates if it shows through an envelope, and it can create urgency, which is one of the behavioral science principles that I highlighted earlier. The member name is helpful for grabbing the member's attention up front. Show them that you know them. Make sure you're including that. The call to action is arguably the most important. We see communications all the time that ask members to complete way too many things and give them way too many ways to do it. So try to keep it to just 3 asks, no more than that, and give clear instructions for how a member can get it done. Otherwise, your communications can become yet another healthcare barrier. The personal signature ties back to those behavioral science principles as well, especially authority. Not only does a signature humanize your communication, but it capitalizes on that behavioral science principle that we know drives action. And finally, the PS is the second most read part of any letter. So use it to your advantage. It's a fantastic way to reinforce your call to action or anything else that you really want to call out for a member. So with that list, you can see that just a quick 10 to 15 second assessment can tell you a lot. If a communication gets a strike or two as I'm going through that list, I know it will likely benefit from a rework. If I get 3 strikes or more, not only am I going to rework the piece, I'm going to recommend looking at everything upstream and downstream in the journey, as well as the strategy wrapped around it, because there are usually quick wins to be had. And so talking about quick wins, I think this is where Drew and his team can really come in.
Sure.
The goal that you guys have is to help think differently about some of those existing and underutilized engagement opportunities that you're already sending out. So I can pass the baton here, Drew, so you can take us the rest of the way.
Yeah, and I'll just make a parting comment on this slide. I feel like not any one specific arrow or call out, but the impact and the tagline of this. If we're not looking at every word we're using in the same way one would think about writing a resume, that every word has a job, and thinking about that job through the interest of meeting that member where they are and driving their engagement, I just think it's such a nice way of looking at, are we getting the most, are we extracting the most out of the words on the page? So yeah, great point to hand off. So when I opened, I said, our hope is that today feels actionable and that it empowers you to do something about this discipline and the intellectual side of what Adrian has gone through. So for folks that, this, I promise, will be the only sort of background slide here. As many, most, or maybe all of you know, Clarity has a deep, deep history within the correspondence space. And so the tools of the trade for us are all of the things that reach your members' home. And that's from member guides to EOBs, EOPs, IDs, letters associated with them, et cetera. We're working, in fact, with most people on this webinar today with respect to these assets as they go towards open enrollment. I think the disservice for Clarity would be to look at these as pieces of correspondence and full stop say that's the end of the value chain. So when we actually think about correspondence is really communication, and it's communication with every member. And in what sense does that then make it an engagement opportunity more than it is just a piece of correspondence that's going out? And so as we're thumbing through these things, you're actually starting to see the wheels of Clarity as an organization and as our strategy, looking at how we can best serve the market. Why do things have to look the way they used to? And why can't they look like the way we know behavioral science is telling us is the better way to drive that engagement? And of course, the endpoint with the Medicare audience from a true business perspective is to drive the economics associated with that engagement. So that depth in STAR ratings, that depth in these particular tools of the trade and serving the healthcare industry, this is just the footnote that you all know this is where we live and breathe. And from a compliance perspective, we know that's important too. So why do we think about correspondence being, in my view, the underutilized engagement opportunity? And Adrian, in one of your last slides, you talked about multimodality and looking at really having multiple channels that were being used. So in total agreement with that, but then zeroing in and focusing on just the opportunity within the print side of it. I look at an underutilized opportunity as one that's fairly easy to access. It's not going to take turning the whole Titanic to start engaging with this particular opportunity. And that's really where Clarity feels like we've got an opportunity to serve. When we look at the tens of millions of pieces of correspondence that are ending up in the homes of members and of dependents and adult caregivers, et cetera, we know that the footprint is already there. And I think when we ask you to look at us as partners and say, so what are you doing with that footprint? What are you getting the most out of by being in those homes already? I start to put my marketing hat on for a second, because I think about the world of opening an envelope that has an ID card and a welcome to your new plan year. And if I'm in my correspondence seat, I say that was delivered on time and at high quality and on the right paper and all of those things that are critically important. But if I put that marketing hat back on and I say, that was actually opened with an open rate that our email marketers would absolutely kill to have. So upwards of 90% that people are seeing that trusted brand, and in particular in Medicare, that authority of, I know that brand and I'm expecting something from them and I feel a piece of plastic inside of there, again, just referring to ID card packages, we know we're going to be read. And if we know we're going to be read, then shouldn't we be saying the right thing? And it really comes down to, we feel every communication is a chance to connect with a member in a way that's sophisticated and in a way that's respectful to them and in a way that's going to help them to take healthy actions. So with that premise in mind, what is it that we do want our Medicare members to engage in? And it may not be ultimately that different from a commercial line of business or from one person to the next, but we know that the way these things are hitting and resonating are two things. One, it's a very unique population. And two, we know that the adherence or participation in these has that direct correlation to the economics of Medicare when we start thinking about star ratings. So here's the intent with a couple of these slides where you're seeing dollar signs. We are not trying to go to bat for it's exactly $9 worth of value for a portal registration. We hear anywhere from $7 to $15, nor are we trying to say that a cancer screening is worth exactly $500 in value. The point is, we know these are things that if more of our population actually engages in them, it's a positive yield for the health plan. So if you're looking at that and saying, I think it's a little more, I think it's a little less, happy to have that conversation. But really where we want to focus on is, shouldn't we be driving engagement of these things in general?
Agreed. And Drew, I just want to jump in and say it's also really beneficial from the member perspective, right? If they get the reminder to go get that colonoscopy and they find something early, they're going to value that communication you sent them so much.
Yep.
So it's really important to keep that member-centric view too, and everything that you're doing, because it'll never steer you wrong.
Yeah, good point. So where and why does it matter? And I said we were going to look at some of the CMS data, just for those of us who are sort of nerding on the numbers here. I've taken just a few of the quality measures that are associated with that next star rating tier. And so if we think about our population and we say, well, if a certain percentage adhere to that particular action, then our star rating is going to be maybe a 2. But as that percentage increases and we get up to that 5-star rating, that's all made or missed just in terms of if we've effectively communicated with that member. And I'm not sharing anything totally novel there, but what I want to emphasize is, do we always realize how razor thin the difference is between being at the 4-star level or the 5-star level? And if I think about MAPD and getting needed prescription drugs and thinking about literally the difference in your population, 89 or 90%, makes you a 4-star plan or not versus a 3-star plan. So am I trying to make the case that the difference in these gaps is 100% made or missed in correspondence? Not at all. I think you'd have to go back to what Adrian's saying from a multi-channel approach. But what I am arguing is, why would we turn down any extra wind in our sails that we can get towards closing this gap? And so even if we've got a couple hundred, a couple thousand out of a million that are influenced by the right communication, we've got to remember that writing the right words versus the more bland words doesn't cost us a dime of difference. And so shouldn't we be designing these to the right end? A couple of these other measures, colorectal cancer screening in particular, we're going to take a little bit of just a day in the life and sort of do a use case on trying to drive members towards that action. Scott, you mentioned in your opening the in-home assessments. I think when we think about things like fall risk, there's a huge opportunity around every home that we get into, reducing that fall risk and having a really positive, in that case, human connection, not telephonic, where we know that we can really drive some stickiness. So wanted to call that one out as well. Again, just looking at 4 or 5 percentage points, it is a big number, but if we can sway those numbers just a little bit by way of, say, a member guide, then certainly low-hanging fruit to do so.
Yeah, no question. I mean, just to elaborate on the point earlier that I made, I mean, another one, in-home assessments, how much is that worth, right? I mean, absolutely, folks are well aware of the Medicare members that they really want to drive for that annual wellness visit or an in-home assessment, et cetera. That has tremendous value in the Medicare world, as we all know. So I think if we can move that needle just a little bit, the ROI on that is huge. And again, to your point, Drew, it doesn't cost anything, right? I mean, you're looking at negligible investment here. It's really just the coordination of the data that Clarity's set up to do already.
So I'm going to borrow back to a lot of what Adrian referred to and just kind of scope in on some of the particular principles that we've seen and have leveraged within the Medicare community. And we're really just thinking about how do we start to best nudge people. And maybe we know that the letter or the member guide that we're starting off with it's effective, but it's not necessarily leaning on a specific behavioral principle. And if we're not aware of the principles we're leaning on, we're not really learning about that population and their resonance or response with it. So you'll hear us talk about the old way that Clarity, has done and continues to do is we're going to make absolutely positive that correspondence makes it to the members' hands. But starting to just encourage and actually even take the reins on, if you would like to lean on some of these principles, can we support you in doing that? So if you were to say, I'd love to learn what the difference between my current letter and one that really leverages this authority principle, that's where we want to be partners in helping you to do so. So I said we'd go into a little bit of a day in the life. Why don't we just put both Joe and Paula in our minds as members that are due for or have the opportunity for that colon cancer screening. Maybe that's something that they've never gotten while they're on our plan. What is the likelihood, just even at a visceral gut reaction level, of us sending one version of the letter as Joe has received it, and then sending effectively the exact same information, but structured just slightly differently through the lens of behavioral principles, and we send Paula's letter? I think, again, most of us would look even across the room at these two pinned up on the wall and say, I'd probably have a little bit more engagement with the way that Paula has done this. And it absolutely bears out in what we've seen. So maybe an existing message can get a Joe to do a very low bar of engagement. And maybe that gets an app download, or it gets someone to create an online account with a portal. But the more we're leaning on the learnings of that tested message, the more we can have an influence with that member as we get into actions that might take a little bit more nudging, or that might take a little bit more effort. We've established that base and they know how to read our communications. So when we start to say, same information, same amount of paper, same amount for postage, but a 25% and depends differently on if we're talking about app downloads or cancer screenings, but these really pronounced examples of, man, that wasn't that much harder to talk to Paula, how Paula really felt was the right way to be communicated with, and to see those actions uptick. It starts to feel like the low-hanging fruit that we should be picking. So we think about it from a micro perspective, a Joe and a Paula kind of in their experience. But if we do go back to being business leaders of our health plan, then it's important to zoom out and say, well, what is the macro effect? And if I'm pulling a few different parts of what we've discussed today, it's not just Joe and it's not just Paula. It's the difference in, we sent out a million kits and we saw either a 10% completion of the requested call to action in those kits, or we saw a 12% or a 17%. Now, this starting point and then this percent increase that we're seeing with the treated letters, it's a nice example of what Clarity has seen in market. You may be starting off with a really rock star letter and you're at 14%, but you want to bump it up to 18%. Maybe this is the first time you've looked at it and you don't even know where you're starting. The point is, we can start to do this in a more sophisticated way without having to do that much more lift. But ultimately, this becomes an exercise in, well, can you prove it? And it's really when we start thinking about the value again and saying, you might argue with me on, I can get 10% more registrations in the portal or 2 or 3% more colon cancer screenings. I'm happy to have that discussion all day, because what I know and what the data has shown us is treating letters with behavioral principles will have a positive pull on the population in some way, shape, or form. And when we start talking about actions like prescription drug adherence or in-home assessments or colon cancer screenings, the value of those actions to a health plan are so high that even if only another 500 people or 1,000 people, but in many cases a lot more, are doing that, the value we can create with that same spend all of a sudden starts to become really strategic. And this is, the numbers, again, you argue with me, that's completely fine. The intent is to say, are we extracting the most value out of our correspondence opportunity? Because anything we gain here, one more person doing an action triggers towards the positive ROI with it. And just to be clear on that, I think we could look at these treated letters and we could say that really feels like a creative services exercise. That feels like if we got a graphic designer, that we could make the changes that we're talking about. At Clarity, we want this to be rigorous. We want to say, look, we did 2 versions, not just from a which one looks prettier, but which one was introducing a new element of behavioral science. And can we prove that that was more effective? And where I think this gets really interesting, and I know when Scott and I are talking about where Clarity is going, it's why we're so excited. If you learn that a particular principle was really effective with your population, that's not a learning for an ID card. That's a learning about your membership. And that's something that you can start to say, if I'm at on-site events, if I'm sending another type of letter, if I'm sending a birthday card, like, I can start to understand what's going to be resonant with them. So I pause on this one just to say, as we do this, and for many of you out there that are already engaged in working on Accelerate Member Engagement with us, you'll start to see dashboards around what worked and for whom. And that's really something that we want to be the deliverable just as much as the treated letter that we think is going to have that heightened attention with it. So we've given you guys a lot. We wanted to introduce, I think, one more poll. So April, if you can help us with this. As you've listened both to what Adrian and Scott and I have shared, we're interested in just what we feel the starting point is. And so when you think about writing that correspondence or what the member communications look like today, questions up on the screen, but how confident are you that you really are leveraging and leaning on behavioral science to drive engagement in and up above just sending the correspondence at all? And we'll give folks just a minute to think on this one and to respond here. In April, go ahead and show us results whenever you feel we've got some folks in. And as we do that, I'm going to go to our last slide here. Again, we completely understand, because we're talking to most of you on a daily or weekly basis right now, you are up to your ears in the logistics of open enrollment. So don't feel as though this has to be pressing now. But when we get to have a clean sheet of paper for 2022, and we get to ask ourselves in January, are we truly writing correspondence to drive engagement, or are we just writing correspondence to get sent? I think that's a great question for some of these member communication meetings. And what type of engagement results are we getting today from our correspondence and that spend? And the reason we want to ask that is we feel as an industry, the expectation should be higher than did the correspondence go out. It should be knowing the metrics of, did this drive action? Did this increase strategic value? And it's really where we're hoping to continue to partner with you on raising the ceiling on what we're getting out of this. So April, great. So we've got, let's see, if I'm just doing the quick math, 34, 70, about 85% are in the not confident or somewhat confident camp. Definitely some people who are tinkering or working with this already. You know, Scott will laugh at me for saying this. I've never effectively sat anywhere close to a sales team. This isn't from a pitch perspective. This is from if these disciplines feel like they would be beneficial to the goals that you're trying to hit in 2022, it's a conversation we absolutely want to have. And so I think with that, I'll close from my side. I will wish you all very well on what I'm sure is a challenging open enrollment season. But we look forward to picking back up in January and having the conversation with you. Adrian, Scott, I don't know if there are any parting words from you guys, but this will be my just thank you to everyone for joining.
Adrian, anything from you?
Yeah, likewise. Thank you everyone for joining, and know that I can talk about all of this stuff endlessly. So if you want to have a discussion and want to understand a little bit more, you have specific questions, you know, would love to follow up with anybody.
Yeah, and I would just say, echo that and say thank you to everybody for their time. And Drew and Adrian, well done. And I think everybody who's listening on the phone, if you're a little bit intimidated, like, wow, there's a lot there, it's really not that difficult. And I would say when you look at, you know, what you're doing internally today, and if you're not taking advantage of that, there's value just sitting there for the taking, right? A couple of tweaks and you can unlock a lot of additional value to drive a lot of these Medicare objectives that we're all talking about today.